around the world these days with the technology that we're using. So thank you again for the opportunity to have a conversation with all of you. And certainly with the Leaders Walk as the topic, I wanted to share my leadership lessons that I have encountered, had to navigate, and certainly engage with during my time in the boardroom. So next slide, please. I think to give it context is to perhaps also understand that when we talk about the boardroom, I want us to think of the boardroom both as the meeting place, certainly in any part of one's career. As you climb in the corporate ladder, there are numerous times when meetings are called in a boardroom. So it could be sitting to discuss, what is going to be the ESG strategy. It could be discussing a marketing initiative. It could be just a sales meeting. Still one slide back, please. And so we use the opportunity in this presentation to say the boardroom can both be the place where you meet with your colleagues in the work environment, or if you're in an NGO or in government in that sense, as a meeting place where people get together, whether it's a round table, over table, or square table. But I'm also using the boardroom in the context of the board, which is the ultimate board or the authority for a particular company or enterprise, and as board members. And so they also sit around a boardroom table. And so as leaders, the lessons from the boardroom and the lessons also in an ordinary exco meeting or in a boardroom meeting in that sense, there are some parallels and lessons that we can learn from all of that. But to start, the next slide would be about my journey to the boardroom. And just to share a little bit about my journey, and what I would want to share with that is to say I started off in corporate. For those of you familiar, I practiced law, I studied law, and then I moved into the corporate environment. But what I found when I was particularly in the corporate environment was as you moved up the ladder into different roles, I found that there were certain things that I felt uncomfortable with or didn't resonate with my values. And in the position, which in the senior position or the different positions I was in, I wanted to make a difference and a change. And so within that scope, I could certainly try and say, let's do, ask questions. Why aren't there more women in this particular role or positions, or how are we choosing to advertise and where we're looking for potential candidates? Or why does this policy seem to be unfair or discriminate against other people? And so, again, sitting in those different meetings, I could see how we could be courageous and ask questions. And I was able to do that in a number of different ways as I was engaging. But what I also noticed was, as you climb the ladder, you could do that within your particular scope. So I had regional roles, and in some areas I had a national role. But it always seemed to be that unless the policy or the decision from the top, like the CEO or the board, was clear, there was always a clash, or there was a disagreement, or they weren't willing or able to perhaps consider more different perspectives. And yes, there are challenges because you're running a business, you're in a business, there are competing demands on time, on resources, on what needs to happen. But I felt that as I was moving up, I wanted to bring others alongside me. And so I used those opportunities to lift others to rise as well as I was rising. But it always felt that there was a ceiling and there's a ceiling. And so I was quite deliberate about wanting to move into the boardroom and to get positions in the boardroom, because I felt that I could make a more meaningful difference by being in the boardroom and actually asking some of the difficult, or if you want to call it courageous, questions around questioning some of the decisions and the criteria and the inputs for some of the decisions that were being made in the boardroom. And so that was the impetus for me wanting to move into the boardroom. And I'll share some more of that through the next couple of lessons that I learned in finally getting into the boardroom and spending time in the boardroom. So again, by way of background, I spent more than 23, 24 years in corporate in both Johannesburg and Cape Town, did some stints in Africa as well. And then I've spent just close on over 15 years in the boardroom specifically, in navigating conversations, being a chairperson of boards myself, and also in subcommittees, being an ordinary non-executive director in the boardroom as well. And so the lessons that I'll be sharing, and they're just some of them, and there are many lessons in the boardroom. We could talk for days on this particular topic. But on the next slide, you'll see I'm going to share 8 lessons, given the time that we have. And just briefly, this is just the headline so you can see where we're going on the journey. Lesson 1, is it a boardroom of ego or an ecosystem? So is it an ecosystem in the boardroom or is it an ecosystem in the boardroom? Number 2, who's who in the boardroom? So it's important to know who's who in the room. Number 3, it's a serious responsibility to be in a boardroom and make decisions. Number 4, know what you bring to the boardroom. Lesson number 5, we'll talk about competence or competition. Number 6, the board CV or the board CV. And if you're listening to me, it's the one with the ORED or the OARD. And again, a big difference between those kinds of CVs. Lesson 7, I just highlight a couple of blind spots in the boardroom to kind of be aware of. And then lesson number 8, I would say, is what I feel is the most important lesson in the boardroom. So next slide, please. Let's jump right into it. So the question I'd just like to ask you, and you can write it down in front of you, is have you considered a career as a board director? Yes, no, maybe. Depends on how interesting I find this talk. So just note that for yourself, and the next slide, please. And so the first lesson I'd like us to explore is the ego or the ecosystem of the boardroom. And a lot of that has, when listening to people who want to get into the boardroom and fellow board members when they're in the boardroom, is the perception and the reality of the boardroom. So certainly for some people, it's the perception that, to aspire to get into the boardroom, to be on that top floor and walk into those hallowed halls and the doors open, and when companies are having board meetings because some other reception area is looking sprucey and clean and there's extra food and drinks being ordered, and it's that very important people are coming into the office today to come and have these critical conversations. And the reality on the other side as well, it can be that, yes, but also it can be simply also just a group of people coming together, making very important decisions that impact the ethics and the effectiveness of the organization, and coming together and having a conversation. The other perception and reality as well is, for some, it's seen as, it's collegial, we're all going to sit there, I'm going to bring my knowledge, you're going to bring your knowledge, and we'll have a lovely conversation. And yes, we can disagree. But actually, in some of these board meetings, it's all about the egos. There are lots of big egos in the boardroom, because sometimes those fellow board members are senior people in their own companies or in their own businesses or businesses that they are running. And so when they come and they sit in the boardroom, you see a number of egos coming over. Well, in this business, this is how we do it. And in my experience, we've done it in this particular way. And often when the ego comes into the room, we lose sight of effective conversations that need to happen with those boardroom dynamics. But also see the boardroom as an ecosystem. I mean, if we think about the inclusive nature of saying, how well are we listening to our customers? How well are we taking into account what our suppliers are saying, what our staff are saying, what's happening in the world in which our particular business is operating? So the boardroom is, yes, part of a broader ecosystem, and how effectively they are able to navigate the resources, the people, the processes, and all of those aspects together is a reflection of how effective those boardroom dynamics are happening. So yes, the lesson I've had to learn there is getting onto a board, and we can talk about that, is one thing, and that is a journey in itself, getting onto a board, but also understanding who your fellow board members are, noticing and being aware of their ego, their dynamics is critical to the effectiveness of that board. Next slide. So if we look at the boardroom, we can look at some of the strengths, weaknesses, and I just did a quick little SWOT analysis of there. because effectively a board provides that accountability and oversight. Remember, a board provides the governance oversight for the organization. It's able to engage with stakeholders, and it provides those risks framework. But if you look at the threats to effective boards, there are often dysfunctional relationships. We've spoken about the ego-driven directors. You can sometimes have a very weak chair, lazy directors, and even, quite frankly, dishonest management, whether it's information management as well. And so if you look at the weaknesses, you can see also how boards operate. They can be time consuming, it can be slow decision making. Some boards can be very compliance driven, as in tick box exercises, but then they're not actually talking to the essence and the values and what does this organization want to achieve. But similarly, what the opportunities are is boards can drive that stakeholder alignment. They can set the tone for the organization. They can see how the operational performance can be improved, not the execution of it, because that's what management's focused on, but certainly they can provide insights into improving operational performance, and then we can look at the positive organizational culture. So there are many meaningful ways in which boards have the opportunity to make a positive impact in the organization, and again, driven by ethical and effective governance. Next slide, please. Lesson 2 is a hard lesson and a good one to learn early on, is understanding who's in the boardroom. So often in a meeting, you would have a chair who's chairing that particular meeting. In a boardroom, you would have the CEO who comes in, you'd have fellow and non-executive directors, you may have a few other executive directors, and you have a company secretary. Similarly, and I'll come back to those people, in a meeting, if you're in a corporate as well, when you walk into a meeting, there's going to be somebody who's chairing the meeting, who's called the meeting. You're also going to have other people. Sometimes you'll have your colleagues, and let's assume they're all colleagues, sitting there. Some will be very quiet, some are going to be very loud, some are going to be walking late to the meeting, be very domineering in the meeting, not want to listen to others, or have a set view about what needs to happen. So understanding who's in the room and noticing the dynamics, be it hierarchy, be it reporting lines, that's all critical for you to notice for yourself in terms of how you show up and respond and engage in that particular meeting. And similarly in the boardroom, when it comes to the chair, noticing who the chair is, understanding the role of the chair. The chair is there to manage the meeting, to manage the engagements. The CEO is coming to provide executive insight. The board provides governance oversight as well. And then you have the directors are there. There's a difference between independent directors and lead directors. And so there's a different layering of directors. But again, notice what's happening with the directors. Have they been there for a very long time? Is there a sense of a bit of camaraderie? Is there over familiarity with the CEO and the chair? Are some directors clicking with one another, or some directors seem to be having conflict with one another? And then in many companies, there's also company secretaries who sit in the meeting. Sometimes they can sit very quietly in the meeting, and other times they can be a vociferous participant in the meeting. If you're new to the boardroom as well, making sure that you build your relationship also with the company secretary, because they will provide you with access to documents, to minutes, to meetings, to documentation that you require as well. But also understanding that the company secretary, whilst reporting in some cases to the chair of the board, also would report to the CEO. And so there are different dynamics in terms of reporting lines, and confidentiality is also quite critical when understanding these particular dynamics. So again, I had to learn those lessons of knowing when to lean in, who to lean in with. Again, if you're very new into the boardroom, consider speaking and building relationships with each of the directors. So starting off with perhaps the chairs of the subcommittee, go and have a conversation with them about, tell me what's the challenges you've experienced in this particular committee, what are the issues that I need to be brought up to speed on when joining those particular boards where that's quite relevant. All right, next slide. We're going to talk about understanding your fiduciary responsibility. I sometimes get asked by people, oh, they'd love to get into the boardroom because they see it as a great opportunity to network with other people. They see it as a stepping stone to earn more money. They see it as a way to perhaps retire early and go and sit on boards and therefore just, you know, swan around and go to a couple of board meetings a year and not have to, stay on in a day-to-day role. And it's a serious responsibility being a director because you can be held personally liable. You have a number of, there's a duty of care in terms of the company's law. There are statutory provisions which guide how you execute your role as a director, and you have to abide by certain, sorry, there's just a noise there. You have to abide by certain requirements, certainly in terms of the Companies Act. We talk about the business judgment rule in terms of how you make decisions and how you come to making those decisions. And then also the King IV report on corporate governance puts forward some recommended principles for directors to be made aware of and to consider and to actually implement. So it's not as simple as, oh, I'm just going to show up for a meeting, tell them about how great I was in a different role or how they can turn this company around and get a paycheck at the end of the day. We are seeing there's an increase. There's always been shareholder activism. People are wanting to hold board directors accountable for the decisions that they're making. And so, again, if you're going to be sitting in the boardroom, the lessons I've had to learn is make sure that you understand the decisions that are being made. And on that point, the business judgment rule stands up front and center each time we have a discussion in the boardroom around making a decision. And just quickly, and a quick summary of that for all of you to be aware of. And it's something, again, you could also apply in when you're having a meeting in a company, in a corporate, is one, to ask yourself, have I obtained all the information that I need that's relevant to making this decision? So have I been diligent about asking for relevant information? Often management would just say, here's a board pack or a submission, and here's the information we think that you need to know to make this particular decision. And even if you're sitting, climbing your corporate ladder, or you're working in corporate and you've been asked to make a decision, should we invest in here or should we open up another branch, and you're given certain information, apply your mind and say, are we missing something? Should we get some further information? What other industry polls or insights do we need to consider to bring into account? Certainly at a board level on that particular aspect, good board charters will provide that that the board members can obtain independent advice from what they've been provided from management. And so you can rely on those provisions to be able to get some additional information pertaining to the decision that's required. The second aspect of the business judgment rule that I always have to keep in mind is the issue of conflict. And the conflict here is, am I conflicted in any way when it comes to making this decision? And that conflict is not only, are there any financial conflicts? In other words, are you benefiting financially from this? Are there any personal conflicts that you may be aware of? And sometimes I think people overlook the personal conflicts aspect. So personal conflict would be, do you know the other person? Are you related? Is it your extended, is your grandmother, or is it your sister's cousin's child, or a personal relationship with the person or the entity or even the organization that may impact this decision. And that leads to the third aspect of conflict, and that's the perception of conflict. So there may be a perception that there's a conflict. And so again, for yourself when making these decisions, be aware if there's a perception of conflict and then raise that, and there's ways and means within the boardroom that is dealt. So that's again the second element of the business judgment rule, and noticing if you have any conflicts as it pertains to the decision that's required. The third aspect of the business judgment rule, and again this is just a quick summary of them, is do you have a rational basis for believing that this decision is in the best interests of the organization? So do you have a rational basis, not an irrational basis? Do you have a rational basis for believing that in coming to this decision, it's in the best interests of the organization? And sometimes I've found that quite interesting when noticing it in other people in the boardroom, because often people will say, oh, this is the right decision because in the company that they work at, this is what we've done and it's worked out for us. Now, that might be the best decision for that company, but is it the best decision for this company, for this decision for this board as well? And so the shift there for people to realize that sometimes the decision that's in the best interest of the company might be a decision that perhaps goes against your own value system, or might be testing a belief that you might have. So for example, if someone, and it has happened, says, why do we need more women in the boardroom? We've kind of got 3 women, we don't need any more, that's fine. Actually, it is in the best interest of our organization in this particular context to have 4 or 5 more women coming onto the board. But for that particular person, their value system is, we don't need more women, there are enough women in the world, whatever the reasons is. And so it's about, is the word mature enough to be able to say, to be able to hold the capacity to have different perspectives to say, actually in this context, yes, it is in the best interest for this organization to, appoint more women, even if for them at an individual level might disagree with that. Now that might sound, give us a more tangible example, but it could also be things about, what about salary increases? We might say, give it the bare minimum because my value system says people must, earn a bonus, or it's different for them at an individual level. But actually for the organization, it might be that we need to have a different approach to what we remunerate people. So again, understanding your fiduciary role and understanding that how you execute it is also governed by legislative principles. Can we continue to number 4, please? So the next one I want to talk about is knowing what you bring. But before we do that, I want to ask if you can just note for yourselves, what do you think are the 2 key reasons for board failures? The 2 key reasons, and I'll just read it out there. Shortcomings in the board culture and values, board dynamics, in other words, the lack of knowledge, skills, experience, diversity, independence, an ineffective chair, charismatic CEO, or board director's tenure is too long. And all of those have been recognized as board failures, and there's a paper at the end that I reference from the Institute where they've covered this. So we've seen board failures where the board culture and values are not necessarily aligned. So in other words, you can see from the board dynamic, so you might have a chairperson that's very autocratic, we're not open for conversation, this is the decision, let's get on with it. We have a board meeting in 1 hour, there's no need for conversation. And that's not in alignment perhaps with the organization, where the organization's one of saying, let's be more consultative, let's, engage with different stakeholders, let's get some more further insights and then we come to a decision. Again, that's also the opposite way around. You can have a board that can be, let's consult widely, let's get different opinions and insights, and they come to a decision, and then you have an organization that's very autocratic and says, no, this is a decision from the top, and let's execute on that. I've also been part of board dynamics where, again, part of this is a lot of the ego, but you can have boards where the skills, and that's why it's important to do board evaluations and to assess the skills in the boardroom, because if you have a board that are mostly accountants, how diverse are those experiences? Diverse boards which have people from marketing and HR and technology awareness can look at issues and decisions from multiple perspectives and then come up with a decision that's in the best interest of the organization. There are also boards where the independence of the board members can absolutely be called into question. They've been sitting on those boards for the last 9, 10, 15, 20 years. How independent are you? What are you not looking at? What are you overlooking as well? Or there seems to be this buddy-buddy system happening with the chair and with the CEO, and let's go for golf, let's go for dinners, let's go for things. As a board director, your oversight, your independence in front of that oversight can be questioned when that kind of behavior is happening as well. Ineffective chairs. I've been part of board meetings where the chair falls asleep in the board meeting and then needs to be nudged awake. I've sat in board meetings where we just, you get in a board agenda and the board chair allows people to go off on tangents. And then we run late and sorry, this needs to be, left over till next meeting. I've had board meetings where board members say, Chair, isn't it time for tea now? We need to go sit outside and have our scones and tea. And then we literally back in the room for another hour and a half and they're like, it's time for lunch. We need to go for lunch. And then it just feels like a whole day is wasted because the actual work that needs to be done is not being managed. So having a chair that can manage the dynamic in the boardroom, manage the conversations is quite important. Otherwise, the board failures that happen there is that they don't reach and make the decisions that are required. Remember that boards are meeting once every 3 months on a quarterly basis. So if the boards are making that decision at that quarter, they're going to postpone the meeting. What happens? They then want to schedule it for another time and then not everybody can make it. And what's happening is the organization now is left waiting for a decision. Because and remember, the boards are making decisions, for example, about policy, what's going to be the policy in this organization. And if they're not making those decisions, in effect, the organization does not have an authorized and approved policy on which to be guided or execute on what needs to happen. So again, manage the chair, managing the dynamics of the boardroom and what's happening is critical. You can also have a very charismatic CEO. Everybody's charmed by them. Everyone's bought into it. Nobody wants to disagree with the CEO. Everyone just says, yes, that's so wonderful. And look what you're doing for the organization. Being a director requires courage. It requires us to ask difficult questions, even of charismatic CEOs, in terms of what needs to happen. And then board director tenure being too long. You see that often in certain boards where there are some board directors sitting in board positions for many, many years. And again, we've seen the different investors and shareholder activism starting to question that. We've also got some guidelines from King 4 on that too. All right, so let's get into the next slide, please. Know what you bring. So this is a cartoon that my brother-in-law is the cartoonist for the Sunday Times, Brandon Reynolds, wrote, where the lion calls all the animals and says to them, for our first assessment today, please climb the tree. And so what the lion's trying to see, let's assess everyone here. Now, of course, for a giraffe to climb a tree, let's see that happening. For a fish to climb a tree, it seems almost impossible. Next slide, please. So what we need to know here, and the lessons that I've had to learn, is understanding what is the value that I bring to the boardroom. So the lesson is understanding what is the value you bring to the boardroom. Now that can be in your work environment or in the board, to the board as such. And so there are a couple of things you need to look at there. Competencies. What competencies are you good at, great at, excellent at, and know a lot of? What competencies are you aware of, but you need to brush up on? So being aware of those competencies is actually quite critical because, again, I spoke about board evaluations. When you're looking at the skill set of your board and you want to have a diverse set of skills, we don't want everyone to be accountants or everyone to be lawyers. But at the same time, if you've got somebody who's got legal skills and they know a lot about cybersecurity, or they know a lot about cryptocurrencies, or they've got great skills and competencies around people dynamics and how to engage with people, bring out the best in people. Those are different competencies that can support the board in the execution of what they need to be doing. Similarly, if you want to aspire to the boardroom, be very clear about what competencies you're going to be bringing to the boardroom. And that's often a question I ask candidates when interviewing them for board positions. What is the value that you're going to bring to the boardroom? Don't tell me you've been a great lawyer or you've got great legal skills. You know, we can outsource some of those skills and we get legal opinions and get the company secretary to provide those things. So understanding your competencies is quite important. Again, functional experience. What are the functional experiences that you have. And again, think of this as on a horizontal line, a functional experience, like you've gathered years of experience in the airline industry. And as you've grown, you've gotten more experience and you've had better international and global experience. And you've perhaps complemented that with additional courses and tertiary degrees and requirements. Your functional expertise has exponentially grown over a period of time. Another aspect of understanding what you bring to the boardroom is that of self-awareness. And this, if the functional awareness is the horizontal line, as you grow, you get, do your accounting degree, you become a chartered accountant, you get more accounting experience. Think of self-awareness as the vertical line and just being aware of self and how you show up. And then the fourth aspect about what you bring to the boardroom is absolutely considering mentoring and coaching. And it's something that I embraced quite early on in my corporate career. I went out and looked and found a great mentor, not just one. I've had a couple at the same time and different ones over the period of time, because we are evolving human beings. We shift and change, new experiences coming to our awareness. We are faced with new opportunities and we're faced with new challenges. And having a mentor, and the difference with mentoring and coaching is having a mentor who says to you and has the time to sit and listen and chat with you and say, gosh, when I was in a similar situation, this is what I did. And so they mentor you and share their experience. And from that, you can explore and say, okay, I could consider this, or what's going to work for me, or how could I use it differently? So mentoring throughout becomes quite critical in how we grow and develop as a human being. And similarly, coaching I have found particularly beneficial for myself. I still, although I'm a professional certified coach, I go for coaching myself as well, because there are aspects that come up in our life that you just want to explore with the coach for a couple of sessions. It could be something I'm noticing that, when I'm sitting in a meeting, I feel myself getting triggered when someone says, says something and I'll say whatever it is, and you work with your coach to unpack what that means. What is that about? And perhaps working with them about, because you have the answers inside of yourself, how can I explore that in more detail? And certainly in the work that I do with coaching men and women in the boardroom, that's a lot of the work about the dynamics, what's happening in the boardroom, and how do you coach and work with a coach to show up better and differently in the boardroom as well. Next slide, please. Now we start talking about lessons about competence and competition. So the difference that and this is a big shift here as well, is there are different competencies that are needed. And depending on where you are, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're in a corporate career or in government, there are different competencies that are required for the work and the job that you're doing. And that's what makes you successful, or you need to learn those particular competencies to become successful as well. But they are related to the job that needs to be performed or the function that you are executing on. And similarly, in the boardroom, there are actually board competencies which directors need to demonstrate. And the Institute of Directors of South Africa, and I've put the link on the slide there as well, has identified 20 competencies which they measure with directors when directors want to be certified or become chartered directors. And some of those competencies include, and I've just put them on, just put 6 of the 20 on there as well. But effectively, they're wanting to explore, do the directors understand, or does the director understand their legal duties? What's required of them? How effective are they in demonstrating corporate governance in the role in the boardroom? Self-awareness is one of the social competencies that is also measured and looked at, I should say, in the boardroom as well. How aware are they of risk governance? When we talk about competencies, it's about understanding what is needed in the boardroom and how effectively you can use them in your development as a board director. So some of the competencies that you're using in your executive management role are going to be different to the competencies needed in the boardroom. And I often see that shift and challenge happening when you see a executive director sitting in a board role, from some of the questions they're asking, because sometimes they want to go very operational, and that's not the remit of the board, where it's more oversight in terms of what's happening with the operational issues. And so it's what I refer to the executive insight and the board oversight. And so there are different competencies that are required when navigating the boardroom and understanding what is required, knowing for yourself how in tune, how aware, how familiar, how comfortable you are with those different competencies will reflect on how effectively you are able to engage in the boardroom too. All right, let's get to lesson number 6. Guys, this is about board CVs, or is it a board CV? It ties in the value that you bring to the board. So I've sat on many nominations committee, and we're just busy with the nominations committee process at the moment. And the number of times that I've seen a career CV, and let me just demonstrate, in my view, explain the difference. A career CV is a CV that says, this has been my experience over the years, this is the academic qualifications I have, these are the skills, these are the competencies. I can knit, I can sew, I'm a great cook, I've worked in these Michelin star restaurants, I understand how to serve people. A board CV is looking more specifically around your board experience. So board CV wants to understand how have you used your skills and experience and competencies, and how is that going to help and serve you in the board, or has helped and served you in your previous board experience. So it's really about when you're crafting a board CV, I say there's a difference again between a career CV and board CV. Listen, please don't submit a career CV for a board CV position. You're just going to get that CV thrown out. Now, what does that mean? Yes, the board wants to know, do you have the experience of working in a committee? Do you have experience of sitting in a board? Now, granted, for some people who have not had any board experience, that is part of the challenge of demonstrating that. However, as I said in the beginning when we started this, when we come around a table, or now as we are working virtually, understanding and appreciating how people make decisions is a skill and experience you can share. So you could be in executive management with no board experience, but you can share. As is executive management, when the CEO has to attend a board meeting, I've had the experience or the exposure of attending the board meeting with the CEO, and through that exposure, I've seen the dynamics, and I've attended, 3 or 4 board meetings over the period of a year. Or as part of my role in risk management, or I've had to develop the submissions or write the submissions for the board pack. So you haven't been to the board, but you've written submissions which the board will read and be able to use to make decisions. So those are the kinds of experiences we want to read and see in the CVs when you're explaining why you would be, because that gives us a sense of understanding what a board would be looking for. I often get asked, how do we make a difference when we present to the board? Because we present to the board and the board says, oh, we don't want this information, or there's too much information being provided. How do you navigate the line between providing the board sufficient information and not too little information as well? And quite frankly, it is a hard line to walk. But it's about understanding what is the role of the board and what are they needing to look at to make that decision. And so coming back to what you put into your board CV, it's about exploring those dynamics and explaining how you've become aware of, exposed to boardroom board experience. It's also helpful to know that in your voluntary time or in your spare time, you help at whether it's the animal shelter or a women's organization, and you sit on and you contribute in a particular way, or you come and you sit in on their boards and you help them perhaps look at the HR or the human resources component, or maybe you help explore fundraising with them. Again, useful experiences that show how boards work. And yes, whether you sit on a board in the NGO, whether you sit on a board that's listed, the levels of complexity will be different, but some of the boardroom dynamics are overlaps. You know, the nature of the board members, what type of chair do you have, what's the CEO like? So there are still lessons that can be shared and learned and then brought across in your CV. Lesson number 7, getting close to the end now. This is about the blind spots. But I put in a poll question. What do you need to get ready for the boardroom? Do you need to understand the competencies required to be a director? Do you need to compile a board CV? Do you understand your functional expertise? Do you need boardroom coaching? And do you need to focus on developing your self-awareness for the boardroom? Again, just something for you to think about, and even where you are right now. Next slide, please. So these are the blind spots, and there are many, but I'm just going to mention these 3 in the interest of time. And the first one I'm going to point out is conflict of interest. Be very aware of conflict of interest. So be aware of your own conflict of interest. Be aware of conflict of interest of your fellow board members and deal with it. And so again, conflict of interest, besides your personal, financial, or perceived, can creep up in boardrooms if they're not dealt with effectively and openly as well. So yes, you're required to declare if there are any conflicts of interest as it pertains to the agenda. And so that would happen on a meeting by meeting basis. So the agenda is going to be talking about, well, let me give you the one that's always a conflict for board directors, and that's when they discuss the remuneration of themselves. They're always going to be conflicted because they're effectively determining what their remuneration needs to be. But there could be other conflicts pertaining to, like, we're going to expand and choose a new property, and your spouse, partner, family, friend is in the property business, and you're in a small area and they might want to pitch for the business. That's a conflict. You've got to expose it, you've got to declare it and deal with it when it comes to that agenda item as it's discussed. There's also the conflict or the declaration of interest, I should rather refer to it as, once a year, where you declare, I have shares, well, that's always interesting. I have shares in the following company. If it's more than a particular percentage of shares, you know, I sit on this particular board, or I'm active in this particular area. So declare those interests. And even if you're not on a board, I remember when I was corporate, every year we needed to declare any interests we may have. You know, even if you've got a side hustle of a business of baking cakes, but you happen to be delivering the cakes to a competitor of the business in which you're operating in, be aware of that, and that is a conflict. It could be perceived or it could be real. Well, it is real if you're baking cakes for a competitor, but again, you need to declare those particular interests. Just quickly moving on to dissenting director, it's very important, I feel, and I've learned this the hard way on a number of different occasions, is to be courageous and to speak your mind. So the way I view it is, we've been asked when you sit and having to make a decision, be it in an ordinary executive meeting or even in the boardroom, you've got to live with yourself. So make sure that you understand what the decision is about. If you're not clear about the decision that's been required, go and get information, sit one-on-one with the CEO or the relevant executive director on this one, become familiar with the issue. Because if you're going to agree or disagree with this decision, be clear about why you agree or be clear about why you disagree. Similarly, if you're going to disagree with the decision, do so, but have the opportunity, or ask the chair if you're a non-exec director, to share your concerns, what you're uncomfortable with, and get management in the organization to respond to that. Because maybe your concerns could be alleviated by management providing the relevant information. If notwithstanding your disagreement and management not being able to answer that satisfactorily, and you've heard your colleagues, you've heard all the different information, and you still want to disagree with the decision, by all means disagree with the decision. And in doing so, make sure that you capture the reasons why you're disagreeing with the decision, and make sure that the minutes reflect that disagreement with the decision and that it's recorded as such. But here's the rider, I would, if it's the rider is the correct word or not to say. Dissenting or disagreeing with certain decisions is healthy, and having debate is healthy. But if you are disagreeing with every decision at every board meeting, reevaluate why you're on that board, because then there's a disconnect that's happening there as well. So disagreeing at times with certain decisions and why, and after you've made sure that you've explained what your disagreements and concerns are, and management's had a chance and the other board members have had a chance to be able to respond to those concerns, and you still are not satisfied, again, disagree and put it in writing. If ever you find yourself in a boardroom with me and I'm the chair, I will ask you what your reasons are to agree to a decision. Because there are also board members who sit, and there might be a charismatic director there who gives lovely reasons as to why this decision we should agree with this, because it's, and everybody gets swayed. And then you go around and what do you think, Pick? And then Pick says, oh no, I agree. I'll say, what do you agree to? What about the decision are you agreeing to? So again, know why you're agreeing to a decision, know why you're disagreeing to a decision. This, like everyone just hops on, yeah, agree, is not also healthy. Because you want a diverse board, you could agree for diverse reasons about that particular decision. Then the last blind spot I would talk about, and the reason why, on the dissenting director, I've given a reference on the last slide with some papers and insights about dissenting directors and how to do it from the Institute as well. The last blind spot in the boardroom that I often see with directors is what I'm referring to here as continuing education. It's that sense of, I've made it into the boardroom, now I can just sit back and, my years of knowledge and experience is going to help me, and that's just going to get me through the discussion and the decisions we need to make. And you find what's happening, just think about 2 years ago, where all of a sudden, yes, we were having face-to-face meetings and sometimes it was telephonic meetings, but all of a sudden we moved on to virtual board meetings, Zooms, MS Teams, all the rest of it. And you could see those that struggled with the technology and the shift and the move to that, but you could also see some of the challenges where directors are not staying abreast of developments. Now, I'm not saying that every director needs to be an expert in cryptocurrencies and cybersecurity and environmental, social and governance issues or the latest NFTs that are coming out. But if a director is not curious enough to want to know, oh, I've heard about that, let me just read up a bit about that and find out more for themselves, you need to think very carefully about how effective they are going to be in the boardroom. They might be very brilliant at their jobs and know the taxations or the accounting, but the world is evolving, technology is evolving, there are new challenges to the environment, to the way we engage with the environment, and you want to have boards and individuals who are curious enough to want to learn about something else. Now, why I say continue education there? Because for some boards who value making sure that their board directors are kept abreast of developments, will actually include in part of their board director development on an annual basis updates to those directors about these recent topics or changes, Companies Act changes or changes that are happening that the board directors need to be aware of. And so as a board, they value continuous education, and so they bring that awareness to the different directors. But I would also suggest, as an individual, take that upon yourself and learn more for yourself about how you can contribute, how you become aware of these issues. You don't have to become the expert in it. But if somebody says to you, what is your view on NFTs, you might say, not saying like I've never ever heard of that, I'm still exploring, or this is what I've read and I'm curious about how that needs to happen. So continuing education, take your own responsibility to learn, and that's in the workplace as well, because We have artificial intelligence coming along, and for some roles and functions in the workplace, that's going to shift and change. And so how strong we are and willing to learn and grow is going to be critical in how effective we are in the future. In fact, Alvin Toffler is an economist, once said, the illiterate of the 21st century are not those who cannot read or write. It'll be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so continuing education becomes quite important. All right, the last lesson, because we're running out of time here, which I think is the most important leadership lesson from the boardroom, drum roll, next slide please, is self-awareness. Now what I mean by self-awareness? Well, self-awareness, as the word references there, is that one, we can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to this. Now, the awareness of self, it might seem obvious, but the number of times I've seen, and for myself as well, we unconsciously respond to something. It's like it's just an automatic response. You know, you step on a stone, you say, ouch, it's an unconscious response. Or we walk with a stone in our shoe and then you kind of notice the stone in your shoe and you take the stone out. Yet we carry so many self-limiting beliefs with us. You know, when people say you've got the heaviness on your shoulders, so think of those self-limiting beliefs as a stone. If it was a physical stone, you would notice it and you wouldn't continue walking for much longer because it hurts and you take it out. But sometimes self-limiting beliefs, noticing our values, are things that we carry that we don't even notice we're carrying. And we only do that when we become aware of it. And so when we are aware of noticing our behaviors and how we adjust to it, we then can manage ourselves, we then can manage others. Because in managing others, we're managing others through how we manage ourselves. If we're able to then manage ourselves, we manage others, you can then see how you can become socially aware. So you notice socially aware what's happening with our stakeholders, what's happening with our customers, what's happening with our employees. If we're able to become more socially aware, we can make a social impact in terms of what's happening. But let's bring it back to how that happens in a meeting. And I'll use an example where it's context dependent. So the audience, I was told, is mostly female. So I'll say to you again, you're sitting in a meeting room, you've been called into a meeting to discuss an aspect, and someone walks in and brings a tray of coffee and tea and cups and saucers and puts that in the middle of the table in front of you. There's a whole room of other people. What do you do? Now, some people will unconsciously do something. Some people consciously decide to do something. So what do I mean? Some people might unconsciously get up and say, go take the tray. What did you want, tea or coffee? What did you like, tea or coffee? And make the tea and coffee and pour the tea and coffee. Other people look at the tray and could say, I'm going to make myself this cup of coffee and I'm going to push the tray down. Other people might look at the tray and say, oh, hi Jane, you're a woman, do the motherly thing and pour the tea for everyone. Some people might say, gosh, I'm so thirsty, you know, let me get up from the other side of the table and I can get the tray and I'll just, you know, pour for everyone because the person who's put in front of, they're busy talking or it's not the appropriate time right now, and they get up and do it. So the putting down of the tray creates different responses, in a sense, for people. And some of those responses are unconscious and some of those responses are conscious. Now I'm using an example of putting a tray in the middle of the table. But imagine something as contentious as, let's just say, giving equal rights to men and women when it comes to maternity leave. What is your value and your beliefs when it comes to that? I guess men and women should have equal amount of time off to look after and nurture children. Or is it, no, that's a woman's job, women's better, they can take the time off, we don't need men to do that. Or what happens if it's about two women or two men? So the awareness of self comes in when we face with situations or contexts, and sometimes our unconscious and our conscious beliefs, self-limiting beliefs, our value systems come into the room in terms of how we respond. And so the dynamics of how effective and ethical board dynamics work are those directors who are more self-aware. They're noticing themselves, they notice their response, they can adjust their behaviors, they can adjust their response. And that impact on the dynamics in the boardroom, the dynamics of the relationship, can be far more effective than somebody who's not aware of self and just goes ahead and says, oh, let's just do this. Let's not worry about equal rights. You know, that'll come around. Let's leave that for the next board or for the next company to deal with. We're not ready for that right now. So self-awareness is critical in your own personal development and certainly in, I would say, in moving, whether it's up the corporate ladder, and certainly it's quite critical in the boardroom in my experience. And so I'd like, next slide please, leave you with a little practice. So it's a little reflective practice that just something practical you could do. And the way we do this is we say conscious action and reflection is a repeatable process. So each meeting, and I invite you today in your next meeting in the next hour or later on today, after that meeting, reflect on your behavior in that meeting, almost as if you were the fly looking at yourself in that meeting. Recall your behavior. You know, what did you do? Did you walk into the meeting? Did you sit down? Did you sit behind the Zoom call? You know, were you prepared? Did you have all your documents with you? Did you keep your camera on? Did you keep your camera off? Notice those behaviors. Reflect on those behaviors. Observe what triggered you in the meeting. Gosh, I was irritated because, you know, Sam was just talking and talking, and can't he just get to the point? He gets to the point and repeats his point. Just hurry up now and get going. And then you got distracted and I went onto email in the middle of the meeting. So noticing what triggered you. And then also reflect on, you know, what could I do differently next time? You know, I wanted to say that, or I should have spoken up earlier, or I disagreed with that. So reflect on how you can make a different contribution next time. And so when you practice that self-observation, you're actually learning more about yourself. And when you reflect on your meeting experience, you're forced to confront your hidden beliefs and the subconscious choices you make all the time. And so it's about bringing awareness to that each time. Next slide, please. And that, I'd like to say, are the 8 lessons that I would remember or reflect on from the boardroom for today. Boardroom, it's an ecosystem or an ecosystem. Knowing who is who in the boardroom and understanding the relationships is critical. Whether you're in corporate or whether you sit on the board, it's a serious responsibility. Know what you bring to the boardroom. Understand the value that you are going to bring to the boardroom. Understand that you need competence. It's a fierce competitive environment, yes, but know what your competencies are and what competencies are required for the role. If you're going to make an application, be aware of having a boarding CV or having a specific board CV. And notice the blind spots in the boardroom. They are different for everyone. The reason why it's called a blind spot is because we're not aware of it. And how we become aware of it, the most important lesson I would say, is through self-awareness. Practicing self-awareness are the leadership lessons from the boardroom I would share with you all. Thank you very much. My last slide is just my question to each of you. What are you going to do? So what are you going to do? Thank you very much, everyone. My contact details. I look forward to seeing some of you in the Business Engage Masterclasses, where we explore a board simulation around the dynamics and what it's like being in a boardroom if you haven't been in a boardroom. Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks, Joy Marie. Any questions for Joy Marie? No? Joy Marie, just if anybody asks, are we able to share the slides with him?
Yes. The next slide also has the link to all my references. Yeah. So you can share that with them.
Fantastic. So I'll do that. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you on the 17th. Please note on the website that whilst we normally have events from 9 until 11, next week, because the MD of Vodacom South Africa who's speaking is going to be in India, we have it on the 17th at 2 o'clock. So please just note that for next week. Have the awesome day. Joy Marie, once again, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Really appreciate it. And have a great day, everybody. See you all soon.
Bye, Carl.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.